Medieval warfare wasn't just about honor, banners, and chivalry. It was raw, chaotic, and drenched in brutality. Beneath the polished armor and poetic myths was a violent reality where survival often depended not on noble blood, but on the weapon in your hands. From tools twisted into killing machines to blades designed to tear more than just flesh, the battlefield of the Middle Ages was home to some of the most savage instruments ever created by man. In this video, we're diving deep into 10 of the most barbaric weapons medieval warriors actually fought with. Not the shiny ones from storybooks, but the grim tools of war that left scars, shattered bones, and shaped centuries of blood-soaked history. Number 1. Executioner's Sword. Unlike most medieval blades that saw action on bloody battlefields, the Executioner's Sword was never intended for combat. This grim tool of death was crafted with one chilling purpose in mind: public beheading. It lacked the pointed tip that you'd find on a typical sword, because there was no need for thrusting or stabbing. Instead, its blade was broad, flat, and incredibly heavy, optimized for delivering a single merciless horizontal strike that could decapitate a person in one clean blow. The sheer width of the blade added weight and momentum, allowing the executioner to put everything into that one fateful swing. But not every executioner was a master of his craft. Some were chosen simply because they had the stomach for it, or because no one else would do the job. When skill was lacking or the blade had gone dull, things got gruesome fast. There are countless records of heads not coming off cleanly, requiring second and even third swings while the condemned writhed and the crowd watched in horrified silence, or sometimes jeered with morbid fascination. This wasn't just a method of punishment. It was theater, and the sword was both the actor and the prop in a brutal show designed to burn fear into the public conscience. The sword itself was often ornate, sometimes engraved or inscribed with grim phrases, religious symbols, or even blessings. It was both a tool and a symbol of authority. In some regions, executioners would carry it in processions, displaying it as a reminder that justice, or vengeance depending on your view, was never far away. The condemned would kneel, hands bound, neck exposed, and wait for the cold edge to fall. That ritual, that stillness before the strike, added to the psychological weight of the weapon. It wasn't just about death, it was about the anticipation of it, the helplessness, the spectacle. Interestingly, despite how horrific it sounds, being beheaded by sword was sometimes considered a more honorable form of execution, especially for nobles or those of high status. It was seen as quicker, less humiliating than hanging or being burned alive. But the reality? It was raw, personal, and often ugly. One man swinging a heavy blade, putting an end to another's life in front of a crowd. There's no romanticizing that. The executioner's sword wasn't made for glory. It was made to remind everyone watching what power looked like when it wore no mask. Number 2, billhook. At first glance, the billhook didn't scream battlefield terror. It was a humble, practical tool, something a farmer might use at the break of dawn to clear brush, prune vines, or hack through thick undergrowth. But when war came knocking, that same farmer didn't have the time or money to forge a proper sword. Instead, he reached for what he already had hanging on the barn wall. With just a few brutal modifications, that agricultural tool became one of the most savage, improvised weapons to appear on medieval battlefields. The transformation was shockingly simple. Blacksmiths began sharpening the inner curve of the blade, extending the reach by mounting it onto longer shafts, and sometimes even attaching nasty little additions like forward-facing spikes or jagged edges along the back. What was once designed to slice through vegetation could now tear through flesh, tendons, and mail. The hook itself made it incredibly useful in the chaotic push and shove of melee combat. It wasn't just about cutting, it was about control. A quick swing could snag an enemy's shield, rip a leg out from under a rider, or wrench a sword from someone's grasp. And once a soldier lost his balance or footing, the next move was always fatal. In the hands of trained soldiers, especially local militias who had spent their lives using these tools on the land, the billhook became a weapon of precision and brutality. It could be used to thrust like a spear, cleave like an axe, or yank and tear like a grappling hook. That kind of versatility made it especially useful during ambushes or narrow fighting quarters like castle corridors, siege ladders, or forest skirmishes. It didn't have the romantic elegance of a knight's longsword, but it more than made up for that with its raw, vicious practicality. There was something deeply personal about it, too. Unlike mass-produced swords handed out by a feudal lord, many billhooks were modified by the fighters themselves. They knew the weight, the curve, the feel of the weapon. It was a tool of survival long before it was a tool of war. And in battle, that familiarity became deadly. Striking with a weapon you've used every day that you've sharpened yourself, carried into the fields, and now into combat. That wasn't just instinct. It was intimate violence born out of necessity. The billhook didn't just cut down trees anymore, it cut down men. Number 3, crossbow bolts with broadheads. In the brutal and unforgiving world of medieval warfare, where strength often decided survival, the crossbow emerged as a weapon that redefined power. But it wasn't just the crossbow itself that commanded fear. It was the ammunition it fired. Specifically, the broadhead bolt. These weren't slender, graceful projectiles like the arrows of a longbow. Broadhead bolts were compact, brutally dense, and armed with blades so wide and jagged they didn't just puncture flesh. They ripped it apart on impact and tore everything in their path as they exited. The genius and savagery of the broadhead design lay in its geometry. The wide, flattened head created a wound channel far larger than a simple puncture. When one of these bolts struck a human body, it didn't just embed itself neatly. It shattered bones, severed arteries, and shredded muscle tissue. And if it hit somewhere unprotected, like the thigh, neck, or armpit, the injury could be instantly incapacitating or lethal in seconds. Armor offered little reassurance either. Some of the more powerful crossbows had such immense draw strength that loading them required winding cranks or using special mechanical devices. Once fired, a broadhead bolt could punch through chainmail, split open a wooden shield, or even dent steel plate at close range. But what made this weapon even more terrifying was how little training it required. A longbowman needed years of strength conditioning and muscle memory to be effective, but a soldier handed a crossbow with a quiver of broadheads could learn the basics in a matter of days. Point, load, shoot. Accuracy wasn't even critical when the bolt could maim or kill through sheer kinetic energy alone. That's why medieval commanders loved crossbows, especially when outfitted with these monstrous heads. It gave their armies an edge, especially in siege warfare, where defenders atop castle walls or hidden behind battlements felt falsely secure until one of these bolts came screaming through the air. The psychological toll was just as brutal. The distinctive snap of the crossbow releasing, followed by the thud of a bolt embedding into wood, stone, or flesh, struck panic into enemy ranks. Wounded soldiers hit with broadheads weren't easy to treat. If they didn't die immediately, they often bled out or succumbed to infection. In a time where battlefield medicine was barely functional, that was often a slower, more agonizing death than the bolt itself delivered. This wasn't elegant warfare. This was engineering made savage, precision designed to kill in the ugliest way possible. Number 4, guisarme. At first glance, the guisarme might look like a bizarre farm tool rather than a battlefield menace. But that deception is exactly what made it so deadly. Built on the long shaft of a polearm, the weapon featured a viciously curved blade that looked somewhere between a butcher's meat hook and a sharpened scythe. This wasn't the polished elegance of a knight's sword or the noble arc of a warbow. This was medieval combat in its rawest form. Brutal, unrefined, and absolutely devastating when used with purpose. The true genius of the guisarme lay in its ruthless practicality. It didn't aim to impress, it aimed to disable. The long reach gave foot soldiers a fighting chance against cavalry, allowing them to strike from a distance or hook-mounted opponents directly off their horses. That curved blade was perfect for catching under an arm, around a leg, or even behind a neck. Once locked in, the wielder could yank downward, bringing the target crashing to the ground, stunned, winded, or worse, ready to be finished off in the mud. And it didn't end there. That same blade could then swing in a wide, dragging arc, ripping through flesh and armor with equal indifference. Unlike a sword that relied on edge alignment or finesse, the guisarme invited chaos. In the thick of battle, where formation dissolved into frenzy and visibility was low, this weapon thrived. It was built for those moments when discipline broke and desperation took over. Its weight wasn't excessive, but the blade's angle did much of the work. The hook caught on things: arms, weapons, shields, even throats. And that's where the damage started. In a formation, guisarmes could be used in succession, breaking up enemy shields and opening small windows of vulnerability for other soldiers to exploit. What made it even more terrifying was its unpredictability. No two guisarmes were exactly alike. Some had spikes welded onto the back, others had serrated edges, and a few carried multiple hook variations on a single head. This kind of customization meant the weapon could be tailored to its user's style, whether they wanted to trip, tear, stab, or gut. And in the hands of someone experienced, it became more than just a tool for mayhem. It became a problem solver. How do you deal with a knight in full plate galloping at you? You wait for your moment, let him get close, hook him by the leg or stirrup, and pull like hell. The guisarme didn't ask for elegance, just demanded results. Number 5, langseax. Carried by early Germanic tribes and later embraced by Anglo-Saxon warriors, the langseax was a weapon that didn't care for subtlety. It was a blade forged not for elegance but for pure function, and every inch of it told a story of close quarters brutality. Somewhere between a knife and a sword, the langseax was a single-edged tool of destruction. Broad, heavy, and utterly unromantic in its design. It wasn't meant to be waved theatrically or displayed with pride on a battlefield. It was meant to end fights quickly, violently, and with little ceremony. Its size made it unique. Too long to be a dagger, too short to be considered a full sword. The langseax was just long enough to give its wielder reach without sacrificing control. That made it ideal in tightly packed formations, where fighters stood shoulder to shoulder with no room for wide swings or flourished strikes. In a shield wall where visibility was low and movement was limited, the langseax thrived. Warriors could jab, hack, and slash with terrifying efficiency, aiming at exposed joints, faces, or thighs. The blade's thick spine and solid build gave it the heft needed to split bone, sever tendons, and punch through flesh like it was nothing. But what made the langseax stand out wasn't just its battlefield performance, it was the intimacy of the violence it delivered. This was a weapon you had to be close to use. You saw your enemy's eyes, heard their breath, felt the impact as your blade struck home. There was no distance, no illusion of safety. Every strike was personal, and that closeness left a mark, not just on the body, but on the mind. For many warriors, the langseax wasn't just for war. It was strapped to their side day and night, used to butcher animals, carve wood, chop branches, or prepare meals. It was a part of daily life, a trusted companion, always sharp and always ready. That duality, tool and weapon, meant that in the heat of a raid or the chaos of a skirmish, the langseax was already in hand, familiar and reliable. It didn't require technique or finesse, just commitment. Swing hard, aim true, and keep moving. It may not have had the prestige of a longsword or the reach of a spear, but in the gritty reality of hand-to-hand combat, the langseax was a weapon that got the job done and left a mess behind. Number 6, burning arrows. In the medieval world, warfare wasn't just about swords clashing or soldiers lining up in rigid formations. Sometimes it was about setting the world around your enemies on fire. Literally. That's where burning arrows came in. These weren't weapons made for precision kills or noble duels. They were made for destruction, panic, and confusion. A single fire-tipped arrow shot into the right spot at the right moment could change the course of a siege or turn a defensible stronghold into a blazing tomb. The preparation was simple but sinister. Archers would dip arrowheads or wrapped cloth in flammable materials, usually pitch, resin, or even rendered animal fat, and then light them seconds before drawing the string. There was a narrow window between ignition and launch, so timing was everything. Once airborne, the arrow wasn't just a threat to the body, it became a threat to the environment. It didn't need to strike a soldier. All it had to do was land on something dry. A hay cart, a supply tent, a wooden watchtower, or, worst of all, a thatched roof soaked in months of summer heat. Sieges, in particular, became a nightmare when fire arrows entered the mix. Defenders who might have been confident behind thick stone walls found themselves scrambling to extinguish fires as multiple structures within the castle grounds caught flame. Buckets of water were passed frantically, people dropped what they were doing, and the once organized defense descended into chaos. The smoke alone reduced visibility and morale. The real danger wasn't just the burn, it was the distraction. While defenders were busy saving their homes from fire, attackers could exploit gaps, send in raiders, or breach gates with minimal resistance. Even when the arrows didn't set something ablaze, the psychological effect was brutal. The sight of fiery projectiles arcing through the sky at dusk or during the dead of night sent a chilling message. It felt apocalyptic, like the heavens themselves had turned hostile. And fire doesn't ask questions. It spreads, consumes, and spirals out of control. Once it started, even the attacking army had to be careful not to let it backfire. Literally. In many ways, burning arrows turned the battlefield into a game of fear management. They weren't just about physical damage. They forced people to make split-second decisions, to choose between fighting and firefighting. And in those precious moments of hesitation, fortunes were lost, strongholds fell, and chaos became king. Number 7. Mammluke Curved Saber. Among the many weapons that shaped medieval warfare, few match the speed, grace, and deadly efficiency of the Mammluke Curved Saber. Emerging from the heart of the Middle East and North Africa, this blade wasn't born on European soil, yet it sent shockwaves through every battlefield it touched. In the hands of a Mammluke warrior, a mounted soldier trained from youth in the art of swift and brutal combat, the saber became more than just a weapon. It was an extension of the rider's arm, a fluid instrument of death that struck faster than most enemies could raise their shields. Unlike the thick, heavy broadswords favored by European knights, the Mammluke saber was slender, beautifully curved, and incredibly light. That curve wasn't just for aesthetics. It allowed the blade to slice effortlessly as it passed through flesh, making it ideal for sweeping strikes from horseback. Rather than relying on brute force or direct penetration, the saber was all about motion, fast, fluid, and unrelenting. A single pass at high speed could open arteries, cut through muscle, or even remove limbs if the strike was clean enough. And when paired with the momentum of a charging horse, the damage only escalated. Skilled Mammluke riders trained constantly to refine their accuracy. They didn't aim for armor plates, they went for the weak spots, the neck, the inner elbow, the thigh, or even the wrist. In close combat, where the battle became a blur of noise and panic, their ability to dart in and out, strike precisely, and retreat before a counterattack made them almost untouchable. The saber's balance allowed for quick recoveries and fluid transitions between offense and defense. It wasn't just about slashing wildly, it was about timing, positioning, and knowing exactly when to cut and when to pull back. But what made the saber truly fearsome was the illusion it cast. Its polished, elegant curve suggested refinement, almost beauty. Yet every inch of that steel was honed to ruin flesh. There was no need for serrations or heavy edges. The simplicity of the curve did all the work. And when the battlefield filled with dust and blood, and mounted warriors began their deadly dance, the shimmer of a Mammluke saber flashing in the sun meant one thing. Someone was about to bleed. Whether striking in single combat or riding through the chaos of war, this weapon combined speed and precision in a way few others ever could. Number 8. Horseman's Pick. When plate armor became the standard defense on medieval battlefields, warriors had to adapt. Swords, once the centerpiece of warfare, began to lose their effectiveness against the new generation of full-body steel protection. Slashing and slicing had limited impact, and so the battlefield saw the rise of a far more brutal solution, the horseman's pick. A weapon that was less about finesse and more about controlled violence, it resembled a blacksmith's hammer, twisted into something far more vicious. With a hammerhead on one side and a menacing spike on the other, the horseman's pick was designed for one purpose: to break through whatever stood between the attacker and their enemy's flesh. This wasn't a weapon you flailed around with wild swings. It demanded intention. The entire design focused energy into a single brutal point, making it ideal for targeting weak spots in an opponent's armor. A carefully aimed thrust could puncture chainmail, shatter bones beneath plate, or collapse a helmet inward with horrifying results. The spike didn't slice, it pierced and crushed. It didn't care about the armor's thickness or the nobility of the man wearing it. The physics were simple. All the force concentrated at one tiny tip, driving straight into the target with savage efficiency. While some horsemen's picks were short-handled and meant for one-handed use in the chaos of mounted combat, others were crafted with longer shafts. These longer versions were especially favored during cavalry charges, where the added reach and weight allowed for devastating momentum. A rider could swing downward or from the side with enormous force, transforming the already lethal pick into something nearly unstoppable. Even a glancing hit could result in shattered bones or catastrophic injuries, particularly if the target had already been knocked off balance by the charge itself. What made the horseman's pick particularly terrifying wasn't just its effectiveness, it was how methodical it was. Unlike swords, which could slash multiple foes with one sweep, or spears which could be thrust rapidly, the pick moved slowly, deliberately, and with grim finality. One swing, one impact, one destroyed ribcage. There was something cold and calculating in how it worked. You didn't need speed, you just needed the right angle, a bit of strength, and the will to drive the point home. It was a weapon for the warrior who didn't mind getting close, didn't mind taking his time, and absolutely didn't care how messy the aftermath looked. Number 9. Caltrops. In the brutal chess game of medieval warfare, not every piece was forged to swing or shoot. Some were simply dropped, quietly, deceptively, and with a singular purpose: to cripple movement and break momentum. That's exactly what caltrops were designed for. At first glance, these spiked objects looked almost too small to be taken seriously, but beneath their simple, almost geometric design was a terrifying effectiveness that made them a favorite among tacticians looking to slow, injure, or disable without lifting a sword. Each caltrop typically had 4 sharp iron spikes arranged in such a way that no matter how you threw or dropped it, one point always faced upward. This clever balance meant soldiers didn't need to waste time arranging them. They just tossed them by the handful across roads, fields, and choke points. Invisible in tall grass, hidden beneath loose soil, or scattered over muddy paths, caltrops turned ordinary terrain into a minefield. For infantry advancing on foot, a single misstep could result in a punctured sole, tendon damage, or worse. Foot soldiers wearing leather boots, standard gear for many armies, were especially vulnerable. The pain alone was enough to halt an advance, but the infection that followed was just as dangerous. Even more devastating was the effect caltrops had on cavalry. Horses were the engines of medieval mobility, fast, powerful, and terrifying when charging. But horses also had vulnerable hooves and legs. A caltrop well placed could lame a warhorse instantly, throwing its rider and removing a key tactical advantage. In the chaos that followed, entire units could be thrown into disarray. It didn't take a wall of spears or a hail of arrows. Just a few dozen of these tiny iron traps could stop a charge dead in its tracks. Caltrops weren't expensive to produce. Blacksmiths could churn them out quickly, and armies often carried them in large sacks for instant deployment. Their cheapness was part of their appeal. minimal effort, maximum disruption. And they didn't care who stepped on them, friend, foe, or innocent passerby. Once scattered, they stayed dangerous until manually removed, which made them a long-lasting hazard during sieges or retreats. But perhaps the most sinister thing about caltrops was the fear they planted in a soldier's mind. It wasn't just about the injury, it was the hesitation. The knowledge that with every step you might be about to drive an iron spike into your foot. That paranoia alone could slow an army, and in war, hesitation kills. Number 10, arbalest. If the medieval battlefield had a sniper rifle, it was the arbalest. This wasn't just a stronger crossbow, it was a siege engine, scaled down into the arms of a single soldier. Unlike its lighter counterpart, the arbalest wasn't designed for rapid-fire skirmishing or quick repositioning. It was built for raw, bone-crushing force, and it delivered every shot with the mechanical finality of a machine meant only to kill. Everything about the arbalest screamed power, from the reinforced steel bow to the thick, armor-shattering bolts it fired, with terrifying precision. The secret behind the arbalest's devastation was its draw strength. The tension required to pull back the steel bow was immense, far beyond human capability using arms alone. So instead of simple hand-drawn strings, the arbalest used mechanical aids like cranks, windlasses, or even rack and pinion systems to draw the string back and lock it in place. This added time to each shot, but the trade-off was more than worth it. Once loaded, the bolt sat waiting like a coiled beast, packed with lethal potential. When released, the energy behind each bolt was enough to drive it clean through plate armor, punch through wooden shields, or splinter enemy defenses with a single thunderous impact. The bolt itself wasn't small. It was more akin to a short spear than an arrow, thick, heavy, and often tipped with steel specifically shaped to concentrate impact force. A direct hit could knock a knight from his horse, pierce a breastplate, or leave an unrecognizable hole in whatever it struck. And because it required minimal physical strength to operate, thanks to the crank-drawing mechanism, it allowed common soldiers to wield lethal power previously reserved for elite archers or noblemen with custom-forged swords. Its impact on the battlefield wasn't just physical, it was strategic. Arbalest changed the dynamics of warfare. Suddenly, armor was no longer the guaranteed protection it had once been. Walls weren't safe unless they were tall and thick. Mounted knights, the pride of many medieval armies, now had to worry about a slow-moving foot soldier unleashing a bolt that could end them in one shot. That shift terrified military leaders and even religious authorities. Its effectiveness was so controversial that high-ranking clergy tried to outlaw its use, claiming it was too cruel, too impersonal, and too powerful for man to wield. But of course, bans meant nothing in the face of war. And as long as the arbalest could punch holes in steel and send shockwaves through formations, it remained in the hands of those willing to crank it, load it, and wait patiently for the perfect, devastating shot.